Well, hello there. Welcome to African Perspective here on Channel 404. I'm Tshepiso Magwetla. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, today, we'll look at the African Continental Free Trade Area. We'll also be talking about the 5 operational instruments that govern it and the AU's largest trade bank, Afreximbank, saying it's unveiled $100 billion financing facility. More on that later. First, our top stories. African leaders are attending the Africa-Japan conference known as TIGAD. The aim of the conference is to boost trade relations with Japan. President Cyril Ramaphosa met businesses on the sidelines of TIGAD. He also held bilateral talks with leaders present. The president has been on a mission to try and boost investment to South Africa. He's expected to emphasize the importance of investing in Africa as an alternative market. And while he's facing many political challenges back home, his biggest problem is the economic growth of South Africa that is very slow and unemployment that is high. The president also met Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari as well. Buhari is expected to be on a state visit to South Africa soon. While there is concern about the current trade war between the United States and China, many countries are looking to Africa for investment. The Continental Free Trade Area has also presented Africa with an opportunity to speak in one voice on trade matters. In Zimbabwe, indications are that the number of food insecure people is slowly growing, and now an estimated 5.5 million people are food insecure, and this has forced authorities to revise upwards the budget for humanitarian support to $464 million. In early August this year, the number stood around 5.1 million people, and the government and aid agencies had appealed for $331.5 million. The UN is striving to mobilize the additional required resources to sustain relief assistance until next harvest.
We first time in 1617 we issued a humanitarian response plan. We mobilized support for drought, flooding, and met various humanitarian need. Again, this year, since March, we have been producing appeal. We had a first drought appeal in March, and then for Cyclone Ida, and then the latest on the 6th of August, the revised humanitarian appeal. Not going into the past, but this current concern is a bit worrying given the challenge in terms of shortage of local production, and as well as huge vulnerability and combination of other factors, including economic transformation, which is resulting in price rise and etc. So therefore, preserving the most vulnerable and supporting those who really need help in rural areas and urban areas, and also engaging with government in terms of its vision.
The Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo has announced a coalition government. The news was cautiously welcomed in Kinshasa, where voters have been calling for change following the election of President Felix Tshisekedi last year. The 66-member cabinet has about 3/4 of officials who will be serving for the first time. The SABC's Chris Okamringa has this report from Kinshasa.
The announcement of the DRC's new coalition government by Prime Minister Sylvester Ilonkamba on Monday has been the talk of town in Kinshasa, particularly the appointment of new faces. More than 70% of the cabinet members chosen from the country's 26 provinces are little known to the general public. But a Congolese law professor says what's critical is whether the appointed officials have a plan to transform the country.
It is not whether we have new people who have never governed, who have never assumed any particular responsibility of any kind, that matters. What matters is these people are ready to be governed. Really being governed means that there is a sense, there is a direction, there is a vision where the country ought to go.
The executive will have a female vice prime minister, minister of foreign affairs, and minister of planning. A move welcomed by many women.
We are very thankful to the President for including women in top positions of his new government.
The new government will also have a ministry for people with disabilities, a first in the country's history.
I'm very happy about the appointment of a minister for people with disabilities. We really appreciate what President Tshisekedi has done for us.
The cabinet appointees are set to be vetted by Parliament early next month before they start work. The new coalition government comes after several months of negotiations between President Tshisekedi and his predecessor Joseph Kabila. The two leaders entered a power-sharing agreement in March this year after Kabila's coalition won a parliamentary majority. Congolese citizens are hoping the new executive will follow through on the new president's promise to put the people first. Chris Sachamringa, SABC News, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
A team of experts tasked with compiling the views of all Basotho across the length and breadth of the mountain kingdom of Lesotho have submitted their final report to the National Dialogue and Stabilization Project. These reports will now be handed over for the adoption to the Ultimate and Final Leadership Forum due to be held in September.
This team of experts were tasked to compile a report encompassing the 7 reforms thematic areas identified as crucial for Lesotho reforms, them being judiciary reforms, parliamentary, security, constitution, media, public sector, and economic reforms.
Up to now, even though through turbulent times, we know that we are set for the successful completion of this work. We also would like to thank the Southern African Development Community and the facilitation team for the wonderful work they have done with a great deal of patience, because you will recall that it hasn't been an easy way, it's been turbulent, and that was characterized, I think, by the last 2 sessions of Parliament, where in the first instance they were supposed to have opened in 1 day to pass the bill, but it didn't happen. They had to do it the second time, but we are grateful that it has been done, and the bill is now due to be converted into an act.
To the experts, a daunting task, but highly fulfilling.
It has been a distinct honor and special privilege for us as experts to work for this highly important national endeavor, which offers a very rare opportunity really to lay a new and more solid, firm foundation which will be able to very comfortably absorb, withstand tremors. That will give our country an opportunity to grow and prosper.
And while to others,
it was a very tense period of time, but it was also very enriching and very fulfilling. And I hope that it will really, really reflect the intensity of the passion and the dedication that the experts have put in.
The 7 thematic reforms areas were recommended by SADC following the political turbulence that saw Lesotho's army commanders assassinated by their junior officers in a space of 2 years. Rapelang Khatebe, SABC News, Masego, Lesotho.
And Kenya has exported its first crude oil on Monday, making it the first East African nation to join the club of petroleum exporting countries. The flag-off of the first crude oil out of country came amid expectations that the petrodollars will spur Kenya's economic growth and prosperity among communities living in areas with the oil deposit. Sarah Kimani has more.
After months of trucking oil from the Turkana oil fields to the port of Mombasa, about 1,500 kilometers away, the first shipment of the crude oil left the country on Monday. The consignment of 200,000 barrels of crude oil was sold to a Chinese-owned Chem China UK Limited. It is expected to fetch Kenya at least 1.2 billion shillings. That's about $12 million US.
Kenya's grand march to oil and gas production and export has now begun. The flagging off of this maiden consignment represents a new dawn, not just for Kenya, but also for our region, and the beginning of a new era of greater prosperity for all Kenyans.
British oil explorer Tullow Oil estimates that the country's oil fields hold 560 million barrels and expects them to produce up to 100,000 barrels per day beginning 2022. Local leaders have called for equitable sharing of oil revenues. The contract on how Kenya and joint venture partners will share the oil revenue remains a closely guarded secret. The petroleum law, however, allocates 20% of the revenue to local government, 5% to communities living where oil was found, and 75% to the central government. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Kenya.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. And listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial.
So as we wrap up Women's Month in South Africa, we again focus on the role of women in different sectors on the continent. Women in the SADC region are working hard to tap into opportunities that are available in Africa and around the world. One of them is company CEO Linda Dlamini. She's passionate about making an impact on the continent. Our foreign editor Sophie Mukwena compiled this report.
Women in the SADC region are also working hard to tap into opportunities that are available on the continent and around the world.
I started around the time when there was a lot of focus. My company was focusing at the time in audit and advisory services. So it was a young women-owned organization. It was a very technical organization. Fast forward 5 years, or no, maybe more, 10 years, in 2012, I merged with a company called Segela to form Segela Klabiso. We were still focusing on audit and advisory services. I mean, when I talk about advisory services, we do things like internal audit, forensic audit, performance improvement, and the like. And as you rightfully said, at the beginning of this year, we're proud that we've become a member of Protivity. This is a global consulting firm that has got a presence in over 25 countries and has got over 85 offices worldwide. So we represent them in South Africa.
She's confident about her company's potential to access both the continental and global markets.
The biggest benefit of being a member of Protivity is that it gives us that global scale in terms of access to resources. And when I talk about resources, I'm talking about the people, I'm talking about the technical resources. So now that we've become a member of Protivity, we can actually do projects in South Africa and outside of South Africa. For instance, one of the recent projects, we were doing work for an airline. It's got offices in Brazil, in America, and in Nigeria. We were able to take on that job. So our membership as a Protivity member allows us to be able to tackle such global projects, both in the continent and outside of the continent.
But how have the challenges facing the audit profession affected business?
What has really happened in our profession in the last 18 to 24 months has really been unfortunate. I think as people operating in the profession, we've taken stock as the profession, and we've said, there's practices that have happened that should not have happened. I think the current situation we are in has also given us an opportunity as a profession to reflect whether we are still fit for purpose in an environment that is rapidly changing, and with change comes with different demands. I don't think we need to throw, though, the baby with the bath water. There is still a lot of value that our profession can bring to the table. What has happened, and as a profession, like I indicated, we've acknowledged that there have been some shortcomings. However, collectively as the profession, we've put measures in place, and I suppose some of the outcomes of these commissions you're talking about are going to give us further guidance into some of the measures that we need to be putting in place to mitigate against such behaviors in the future.
Women around the world face similar challenges, and Dlamini's advice to them is to remain resilient.
There is so much support for women when they're doing things at a micro scale. There is no expectation that a woman can want to lead a mega organization. I saw it even in my own experience that, when I was a small organization, I was a 5 million organization, I was starting out, the support was phenomenal. Everybody wanted to make sure that I succeed because I was micro. The minute I said, I want to play with the big boys, that's when the problems started. That's when I started getting a sense that there's conversations that people are not comfortable having with me. Conversations that they would rather have with a man.
Gender equality seems to be the biggest challenge women are facing. Sophie Mugweni, SABC News, Johannesburg.
The operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, has been launched with 27 countries as signatories thus far. The AfCFTA will be governed by 5 operational instruments, in other words, the rules of origin, the online negotiating forum, the monitoring and elimination of non-tariff barriers, a digital payment system, and the African Trade Observatory. The AU's largest trade bank, Afreximbank, has unveiled a $1 billion financing facility. It will enable countries to adjust to an orderly manner to sudden tariff revenue losses as a result of the implementation of the agreement. Tonight on African Perspective, we focus on various themes of this, including its proposed benefits. Whom will it benefit? What happens to regional economic communities? And how does the AfCFTA function along existing agreements? Joining us now to discuss this, Catherine Grant-Makokera, Director at Tutwa Consulting Group. On my left, Lebohang Peku, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective and Political Economist on my right. Very good evening to you both, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps let me start with you, Ms. Peku. Looking at the promised agreement, some say perhaps it's promising a bit too much in terms of the benefits of what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is proposing. What do you think are most realizable in the short term? Let's start with that.
It's hard to say because there hasn't been a short-term view on African regional trade. This conversation has been in the pipe since Abuja, the Abuja Treaty, 1991. So I think the attempt to try and microwave this into compressed bite-sized 1, 2, 3, 4 segments has probably been quite inimical to a deep fundamental understanding of the complexities of trying to aggregate very different asymmetric economies across the continent. I mean, Lesotho is not DRC, Rwanda is not Nigeria, and so on and so forth. And also sometimes often with very different interests, national sovereign interests and so forth. So in the short term, if we can at least have a more open and transparent conversation about what these national interests are, how those link into regional economic interests, then we can begin to build these building blocks more effectively.
That lack of agreement on the big and larger picture, is it possibly why we've seen Nigeria hold back somewhat on being a signatory and having even more countries endorse this?
I mean, national interests, national sovereignty, economic nationalism, all the things that I think, are very difficult when you're trying to build a building block which is advertised as having equal benefits to all parties. They cannot be equal benefits to all parties because not all parties operate in an equal environment. They don't have the same social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, different currency values, and
I suppose that the same dividend rate when it comes to the individual markets, Catherine. But when we talk about jobs, which is the biggest thing that Africans are looking towards, is that something that will be as realizable as is being projected out there? Something like a GDP growth of 35% in the next couple of years that will lead to jobs.
I mean, I do think that the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement are overstated by most studies. I think it makes a lot of assumptions when you hear those figures about the dramatic increases in growth and the sudden increases in trade amongst African countries that is supposed to come about after the agreement comes into force. And the assumption about how it will impact on jobs requires you to really think about the linkages between what a trade agreement, which is a legal document, it's a legal construct really, negotiated by government officials. For it to become real for anybody else, it needs to be implemented. And this, of course, has always been the stumbling block for many of these other attempted grand regional integration initiatives on the African continent, is we're good at putting things on paper and making the agreements themselves look quite nice, quite sophisticated, quite appealing to economists who model the impact. But then you have to implement, especially if you want to see any trickle down to jobs. That said, I do believe that exporting firms, and certainly the data shows this, are more likely to create jobs than firms that remain just constrained to their domestic markets. That can be a challenge, however, depending on the particular firms involved in trade and whether they can in fact be competitive in other markets. So there's a whole lot of issues that would need to be resolved before we would safely say that this thing will create more jobs.
I mean, Ms. Poko, some of the projections point to a significant reduction in poverty, especially in various countries. And I'm wondering if some of the infrastructure that's already in place to allow people to trade within Africa, why has that not led to such benefits? Why have we not seen at least meaningful enough socio-economic change within the existing partnerships? And we'll come to those regional economic communities in just a moment.
So especially because there are already several preferential trade agreements within our existing RECs, SADC, COMESA, the East African Community, ECOWAS, and so on and so forth, the Maghreb region in North Africa, and so forth. So one would have thought that those would already have had some kind of an impetus towards much more aligned and much more streamlined economic benefits across and within countries and regions. And secondly, the multiple poles of regional economic communities. So several countries already belong to multiple RECs, which is quite difficult. I mean, at least 4 countries I can think of off the top of my head belong to at least 3 or 4 RECs. So that means that in terms of tariff bindings, import and export duties, it's incredibly difficult to then assess on which terms they are actually trading. So those sort of really, that's the stuff that people don't like to talk about when we come out of those wonderful meetings in Addis and, get all excited and all Africa unite. It's very important rhetoric, but it's rhetoric nonetheless because there's really hard work around that. So those benefits are not going to really flow because the existing contradictions and the existing economic infrastructure really hasn't been dealt with. Also bearing in mind that a lot of countries are hampered and subject to the World Trade Organization rules, which are very restrictive already, and they've got particular issues around most favored nation treatment, NTBs, and so on and so forth. So if we then compound the existing complexities within the regional economic communities with that massive overriding body, although it is becoming more and more peripheral, in my opinion, and the unwillingness for many governments and lawmakers, legislators, our own national, thinkers, policymakers, and think tanks to do that kind of really involved work, it does become a bit difficult then to then say that this is really beneficial to all. And the kind of these grand research papers which are quite problematic.
Catherine, I see that the wheels are turning there in your mind, and I'm wondering which aspects you agree with, what do you want to add to?
I very much agree that we're entering quite a complex stage of African integration, because what initially was hoped with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is that it would in fact be a way to unravel some of the knots of the multiple memberships of the existing regional economic communities. But what we're seeing in the end is that we're putting another layer on the top of the existing, it's been called the spaghetti bowl, it's been called various other things. And so we're in fact adding another layer of complexity, in fact. And so what you're going to have is traders are going to be confused in the first instance, in my mind. If I think about this in practical terms, and I'm a exporting firm in Zambia, perhaps, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about this Continental Free Trade Agreement coming into place. To me, it's just adding a whole nother layer of options and things I perhaps need to understand, different rules, whereas I've already got SADC rules. If I want to trade with some countries, I've got COMESA rules. If I want to trade with somewhere else, now I'm going to have another third set of rules that I need to understand.
So if the AU recognizes 8 of those regs, for instance, isn't there an opportunity then for simplification of rules, so of streamlining the idea, the thoughts behind free trade?
So the whole idea, so the AfCFTA comes from, it used to be the TFTA. I think when I first started writing about it, feels like a million years ago, and then it became the CFTA. It's been an aggregated gradualist approach. So the whole idea was to link up a few of the regs at a time, and then eventually they would all somehow come together and metamorphose into a single coherent unit.
But then, as you mentioned, we've seen overlapping of memberships in some of those
overlapping national sovereignty, overriding, economic imperatives, a lack of harmonization on basic, how do we do this? Does a bag of rice in Botswana, do we measure it the same way as we would weigh the same bag of rice in Kenya, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Algeria?
So those just on that, why do we have different rules of origin, for instance, of a single product and how it trades then from country to country?
Rules of origin are critical, and in fact, rules of origin and non-tariff barriers are probably the 2 biggest trade issues in the world right now. Rules of origin are about how you decide where a product comes from, and they're critical because when you have all these various agreements in place with different trading partners, you may have preferential treatment for a product if it's determined to come from one place versus another. So if my scarf has decided to come from Egypt, perhaps, then it could enter South Africa on preferential terms than if it was considered to be made in India. And so the rules of origin are very, very important these days, especially as we've seen a lot of manufactured production move into complex global supply chains, where you don't have production taking place in just one place. It's all divided up into many different units around the world. And so this has become a tool for protectionism, definitely. An important tool in many ways also to try and deal with illegal trade. or the trade of falsified products, illicit goods, and it's also linked in other ways to the complex issues around transfer pricing and tax manipulation by a lot of multinational corporations. So it's got a whole lot of various strands to it. And the negotiations are bogged down on rules of origin in many areas of trade issues, both in the African continent, but it was a sticking point, for example, in the US.
So let's take a quick break, and I wanted to pursue that discussion, especially alongside the issue of nationalism, which you mentioned, Lebohang, and what that means for future agreements on this. So don't go away. We're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area here on African Perspective. We'll be right back in just a moment.
During Women's Month, what I think we should remember as women, both in our personal and in our work lives, is that you never know what the future is going to bring, and always to keep a sense of optimism, because there really are endless possibilities for what you can achieve and the good things that are going to happen to you.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month.
Well, welcome back. You watching African Perspective here on Channel 404. We'll also be talking about women entrepreneurs betting on the African Continental Free Trade Area to grow their revenues through increased intra-African trade in agricultural produce. Currently, Africa imports food worth $35 billion, largely from outside the continent. The United Nations estimates that the trade agreement will by 2040 increase intra-African trade in agricultural products by between 20 to 30%. So how is this mainly women-led sector preparing for the windfall? Sarah Kimani met Beatrice Kakuba, the Executive Director of our One Africa Network of Women in Agribusiness, and filed this report.
Africa's food economy is dominated by women, from production, processing, distribution to sales. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, estimates that women make up 50% of the agriculture workforce on the continent. Despite this, their participation in agribusiness has failed to earn them favorable profits.
Because agriculture, until today, you'll be surprised, if you go to former financial institutions, they still consider agriculture as a risky business. Then they cannot lend money to that. And also access to market. It became a challenge because market has its own rules. Now when you go to markets, you have to meet the standard, the traceability for the product. Now, if you're in a rural area where there's no road access, when there's no cold stores to store your foods or good packaging, you can't sell on any market these days.
It is these gaps that African Women Agribusiness Network, our One Africa, saw and sought to seal, first in East Africa in 2003 and last year across the continent, offering women across the agribusiness value chain training on leadership, financial literacy, and market access.
You can find women who are trading and who have their capital from 50,000 to 1 million, but they don't know how those markets, and some of them maybe are not financially literate, and they don't know what need to trade in this market. If you are from East Africa, even to go to another country, if you are from Kenya, to how do you trade with Uganda, most of them is how much tax. They don't even know that we don't pay tax in the East African community.
In June this year, our One Africa launched an online platform that brings women entrepreneurs in agriculture together virtually, providing them access to buyers, market information, as well as other available opportunities in their business. The entry into force of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area could not have come at a better time for them.
The value of our product. I think in any way you want to look at it, it's an opportunity for us.
Our One Africa currently has 1,200 women groups registered on its network, drawn from 35 African countries. It hopes to grow that network to 15 million women and youth by the end of next year. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Kenya.
So as you can see, we're discussing the African Continental Free Trade Area on African Perspective, various aspects of it with Catherine Grant-Makokera as well as Lebohang Pheko. So you saw that report from my colleague Sarah Kimani on specifically women and agriculture, what the easy pickings possibly could be for them. Your thoughts on just some of the challenges, but what the projections are.
Yeah, so I mean the low-hanging fruits that we keep being told about. I mean, most African countries so far, I mean, 37% net importers of food products and farm, including, you know, unprocessed food products, which is quite an irony because we have arable land, massive land mass, and in the context that many countries are coming to rent land here in order to conduct their own agricultural activities. The other thing as well of that is that the AfCFTA doesn't necessarily deal with those sorts of complexities of food sovereignty, food provision, and so on, food pricing as well. Where are the inbuilt markets? And this is also because, you know, in many respects, many countries, you know, agricultural boards were dismantled many years ago under, you know, structural adjustment policies and so on. So that kind of central regulatory body and state-centric approach to then enabling there to be an inbuilt market isn't really there. So if it isn't there, it then makes it very difficult for commercial farmers and small-scale farmers on the continent to then begin to be viable. It also speaks about the possibility of ensuring product for small-scale farmers on the continent. This is a contravention potentially of WTO rules because, you know, there's food subsidies, agricultural subsidies. So those contradictions again really have not been dealt with. And lastly, I think in relation to the fact that many countries have stored up huge amounts of food, there's public stocking or something they call it like that, where countries like China, who have 6 months worth, and that's a population of 1.4 billion, 6 months worth of essential, you know, stock, wheat, rice, stocked up. And mainly, you know, South Asian countries, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, and also Brazil as an outlier in Latin America. It's costly to do that, but some people argue that African countries must begin to do that because in relation to famine, to, you know, displacement and so forth, and climate change, do we have a contingency plan? And yet the AfCFTA doesn't make any reference to that. So by the time we get to the women who are then small-scale farmers or agricultural entrepreneurs, there really hasn't been really any explicit provision to support them, and many states have completely dismantled their capacity to support them.
So Catherine, is it a misnomer that it'll improve and encourage competitiveness?
No, I don't think it is a misnomer completely. I think that there will be aspects of the agreement that will be positive. I do believe that encouraging greater levels of intra-African trade as an overall objective is something we should all get behind. And so from my point of view, I'm a little bit cynical about its implementation and operation, but I am impressed by the level of vigor and commitment that we've seen to an important agenda. So I wouldn't want to come across as saying that there would be no benefits. I do think that there are a lot of challenges still to be overcome to make it operational.
I mean, you spoke about protectionism earlier on, and I know, Lebohang, in previous conversations you've mentioned how it's important for regions like Africa to really start thinking about how we're going to navigate our space within that. And I'm thinking, Catherine, about the textile industry, which is one which also benefits women greatly. So how do we then start rethinking the level playing field?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue in the context of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because we are at the same time as pursuing sort of freeing up the trading arena, industrial development policies. In most African countries, if not all, industrialization is a big agenda. And what we're seeing is that in the AfCFTA negotiations to date on goods trade, they have in fact indicated that countries will be able to exclude up to 10% of products from liberalisation. So there is already a sort of a concession built in there that countries can put on the table products that they do want to protect their local markets from the competition from other African countries. That could be negative for the agricultural entrepreneurs that we saw in that clip, though, because agriculture is a traditionally very sensitive set of issues in trade agreements globally. But it also could include the usual suspects of things like textiles and clothing, and you'd expect some countries, maybe automotives. The normal targets for protectionism could be in that group.
So reflecting on that, Lebohang, including agreements that we already have in place, we'll talk about AGOA, for instance, where we've seen very problematic toing and froings of how we should negotiate in order to protect our markets and also ensure that we grow further without being overtaken or taken advantage of by, say, the United States.
Or the European Union. So, I mean, these negotiations take place in the context of the economic partnership agreements. We still have a pending the TDCA, under which South Africa was bilaterally trading with the European Union, and as you rightly say, the AGOA. Now, the potential for that of course, for African countries has been quite immense to some extent, especially in the textile sector. Lesotho having been a particular beneficiary, their Angora products and so forth, and mohair. The difficulty with that, of course, is that the competition from other countries, and in the context of a global FTAs, is quite immense as well. So you have Vietnam, which has exported about $17 billion worth of textiles over the last few years, in an era when at a 17% tariff, whereas with no tariffs whatsoever, African countries in total have exported 1 billion rands, so $1 billion, I should say. So already the scale, in terms of the economies of scale, we are not there's nothing to stop countries like the United States or the European Union looking to other markets who are willing to pay those tariffs and still getting their own return on investment. And we need to think quite carefully about that, because the CFTA does not occur within a vacuum. I agree absolutely that it's very necessary precisely because it doesn't occur in a vacuum, precisely because there's so many contending multinational, multilateral, plurilateral and bilateral bits of architecture taking place around us. And we cannot, we have to think about trade diversion, we need to think about preference erosion and so on. And so having our own internal anchor as a continent is incredibly difficult, but still incredibly complex.
So, Catherine, I think you'd agree with some aspects of that.
Yeah, I agree with some aspects of it. I guess I am a fan of legal certainty when it comes to trade. So I do find that the Economic Partnership Agreement is a progressive step forward in our relationship with the European Union in many respects, because I think it did put us on a very certain footing, both regionally within, for example, the Southern African Customs Union area, but also for one or two of the other regions that have secured agreements. I find AGOA to be it's not a trade agreement. It's a bilateral piece of legislation that can be withdrawn and amended at the whim of the US politicians, which we all know at the moment is a fairly whimsical business. So I would like to see, for example, consideration being given to the proposition that African regions should have trade agreements with the US. And so in that light, I think it's critical to get the Continental Free Trade Agreement in place, but to do it carefully at the same time.
So we'll look at the legal instruments, but I saw you shake your head, Lebohang, on the wording or the categorization of progressive with regards
the EPA.
Yes.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my wasted youth writing about the EPA. And I mean, I think for me, it's kind of a template or a motif of how we've been doing multilateral or bilateral trade. The word partnership I thought was very problematic, because partnership it does seem to imply some sort of an equal footing, which the EPAs didn't really illustrate. And unfortunately, that's become the way it's kind of a symptomatic of the ways in which Europe and the US tend to trade with the rest of the world, particularly the global South, quite disrespectfully and very much with their own interests at the helm, and reproducing some very problematic power power play from previous eras.
Okay, so Lebohang, hold the thought, because when we come back from the break, I want us to reflect that mirror back onto the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and see if those conditions then exist, if there will be equal or power play in that sense as well. Don't go away. You're watching African Perspective.
What should you do to avoid getting ill?
Eat healthy, not to do drugs, not to smoke.
To learn more about some of the most common illnesses and how to avoid them, join Dr. Sidlo Mudang each week and get all your health questions answered by experts.
What are those signs that people should look out for and say, this is time for me to go and seek help?
It is very important to identify and address those problems as early as possible.
You are a fighter, you are a warrior, and you will get better.
Right here on Health Talk.
Welcome back. Wrapping up our discussion on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we're in discussion with Catherine Grant, Makokera and Lebohang Pheko. So just coming back to the last part of our conversation, we're talking about equal partnerships and looking at this agreement. Do the conditions exist for countries to negotiate with each other in that way, Lebohang?
Yes and no. The recs are usually, unfortunately, SADC is not really functional as an economic bloc de facto. I think SACU is a lot more effective. It is the customs union, isn't it, to all intents and purposes, and especially because you have a couple of very dominant economies, South Africa being the big sister in the region, and the resentment and the mistrust from many other economies that comes with that, even though we're also one of the biggest loan-free, no strings attached investors across the continent as well, in infrastructure and in soft loans, but nevertheless our reputation, regrettably, precedes us. So those sorts of power dynamics are reproduced across the continent. So that would be Nigeria in West Africa, that would be Egypt in North Africa, and perhaps Algeria, but not so much. That would be Kenya in East Africa, and of course other small mini hegemons also emerging in East Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on. But I think in terms of track record, stability, longevity, Kenya being a very strong pillar or anchor state. So if we're not able to deal with those contradictions and those inbuilt resentments, the fact that there are some bigger sisters in the region, we won't be able to move forward, and who are protecting themselves very vigorously, but also reproducing some very toxic power play themselves.
And I want to reflect on that, Catherine. We see that between South Africa and Kenya, as you mentioned. We've seen that with South Africa and Nigeria. Some would say, who can forget the whole MTN saga? So how do we prevent that from being replicated and not having other countries being swallowed up by these existing
I was in Tanzania recently, and this question came up very strongly there in conversations in the SADC context about mutual benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and they're having a very vigorous debate actually amongst different stakeholders in the economy there about this, and South Africa was certainly mentioned very explicitly, and I think that in many ways there is a perception amongst other African countries that the bigger players, the ones that Lebohang's mentioned, are driving this initiative because it is actually a way to bring them together. Funny enough, the regional economic communities haven't allowed the connections, for example, South Africa to Kenya, South Africa to Nigeria yet. We've been operating as the anchor states of our various regions on the continent, but this continental agreement will be the first time that we actually see connections between the big players.
So before we run out of time, I must ask this question. When we talk about free trade, how free is free? What exactly do we talk about?
Free, yeah, exactly. No, free is a misnomer. Free in many respects comes from the removal of tariffs, of duties. The reality is that most goods move around the world these days completely duty-free. And so I guess that's where free lives up to its name. But the reality is that there are many other mechanisms that impede trade. There are rules of origin, there are non-tariff barriers like standards requirements, packaging. You can have stops at the border, customs documentation issues. So I think anybody who's tried to trade will tell you that there's certainly some costs to be paid. It's not free.
And to add to that, phytosanitary rules, which have inhibited the capacity for African countries to export their goods, especially to the EU, because, a few Europeans think that, to put it crudely, that African goods are not hygienic enough, which is incredibly insulting, and also illustrates that it's very expensive to export, and that there's an asymmetry in the ways in which global power relations play themselves out. And then the TTIP, which was abandoned now under Trump, but I think it's been held in abeyance, but I don't think these things are ever completely off the shelf, was also causing a massive, a bit of an economic civil war between the European Union and the United States, where the European Union also felt that the United States were being too demanding and playing the big brother, and also making demands across sectors which don't even fall under trade, such as culture, media, graphic design, intellectual property. Interestingly enough, there's very same complaints that African countries and Caribbean countries and Pacific countries had in relation to trading, the negotiations across the EPAs. How can we, within the AfCFTA, avoid reproducing the same? And we need to be much more creative around that.
So in that token, in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you each, what do we need to focus on to improve this? Catherine?
Broad-based engagement on these issues. I don't think this should be left to a very small group of government officials from African countries. I think that, we need the private sector, we need civil society in the room.
I agree. But it has to be bottom-up. It can't be state-to-state entirely, because in many respects, most African people are inherently more integrated socially, culturally, and, informal and parallel trade. So rather than trying to rely on states to legislate, let's also have a bottom-up conversation.
Well, thank you very much to you both for a very informative and educational discussion. Catherine Grant-Makwakera, Director at Tutra Consulting Group, and Labang Peko, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective and Political Economist. Well, that's all we have for you on African Perspective this week. Next week, we'll look at food production in Africa. Sarah Kimani, our East Africa correspondent, will be attending a conference on agriculture in Accra, Ghana. We now leave you with a short clip of a news presenter who's had to apologize after likening her colleague to a gorilla. While the reference was made in jest, many viewers were offended. Take a look from all of us here. Good night.
Zoo just posted. Okay, you have to see this. This is Finn. We're about to show. Oh my goodness, take a look at him. He's a resident of the Oklahoma City Zoo, and this week the zoo's 8th caretaker took over their Instagram, and we are all loving that they did. And as you can see, Finn was fascinated. Definitely ready for his close-up. Kind of looks like